As we look forward to the coronation of Charles and Camilla, there's quite a bit of chatting about the role of Queen Consort. Leanda de Lisle is joining us today to talk about a couple of Britain's most famous Queen Consorts, Anne Boleyn and Henrietta Maria. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am here with Leanda de Lisle, and we are going to be talking about some women who were royal, a bit of a rebel, and quite romantic. And I'm so excited. Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm really happy to be here.
Well, let me start by asking, you have written a number of different books and you speak about history and you're very involved in history. And it seems like you are drawn in particular to the Tudor and Stuart eras. So can you tell us a little bit about what brought you into history in general and into those time periods in particular? What was the thing that hooked you on history?
Well, it's full of great stories, isn't it? I was a little girl. I was a bit of a tomboy, actually. So I liked climbing trees and, riding horses. But I also liked books. I loved, and I loved exciting stories. And history was full of exciting stories. So I always enjoyed history. And I was drawn to, different characters, particularly, I suppose, women, strong women, so I went on to study history at Oxford University, and then I went into journalism for a while. I've always written, basically, and then I decided that I did all sorts of different kinds of journalism, including I was a columnist as well, doing different kinds of columns, opinion columns, political columns, funny columns, all sorts of different kind of things in newspapers, magazines. But then, I thought, no, I really would like to go back to history and really do some research. You don't tend to do, you do some research for journalism, obviously, but it tends to be very immediate. You're commenting on things that are happening right now, this moment.
Right.
And I wanted to take some time. And so I went back into writing history. And I always loved the Tudor and Stuart period. And so I started there.
Oh, that's wonderful. I did not know that about the length of time you were in journalism. That's really interesting. And I'm sure, you mentioned you've always been writing. And of course, as we read your books, we can tell that. But that's really interesting that you have that sort of here and now, and then also looking back. That's fascinating. So speaking of lately, there have been a couple of things that you have been involved in just the last few months. And I say last few months because the Boleyns scandalous family has only recently come to the United States. So I know it was, produced earlier and broadcast in Britain earlier, but we in the US have just recently seen it on our public broadcasting channels. And if you have missed it, I've noticed that they are rerunning it sometimes. But can you tell us about that experience, maybe about what you learned about Anne Boleyn, or what maybe surprised you as you got into looking at this quite famous and in some ways infamous woman through her family, and maybe in a different way than we have in the past? And also just what was it like being involved in that creation, in that creative endeavor?
Well, it was great fun being involved in it. I wrote a book about the Tudor dynasty, the Tudor family, and particularly on their relationships. And so that's probably why I was invited to take part in the series. And so I was quite sort of well prepared for it, but I had focused on the Tudors, and of course this was also on the Boleyn family, So I suppose it was really interesting to hear more about Anne Boleyn's father and so forth. And I was asked to talk on behalf of Mary Boleyn, which was quite interesting because although she appeared in my book, she wasn't a sort of main character, since I was focusing on the Tudors and their family relationships rather than the Boleyns and their family relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I very much enjoyed that. Very much enjoyed bringing her to life, I hope, as a sort of three-dimensional human being. And that's one of the things I enjoy doing in my books is really thinking about these people and what made them tick. And in her case, I felt very sorry for Mary Boleyn, although she was a survivor. I felt sorry for Mary Boleyn because, I mean, she really suffered her own kind of Me Too moment when she was essentially, obliged to have an affair with Henry VIII, and when she was already a married woman, and then being kind of abandoned by her family when she was a widow, and then falling in love with a younger man and marrying him, and Anne Boleyn, her sister, sort of essentially rejecting her as well. But Mary really kind of fighting back and saying how she'd rather be with this young man than be the greatest queen in the world, which is obviously a sort of dig at Anne. And she does seem to be happy. And of course, she had children and heirs who became very close to Anne's daughter Elizabeth in due course, and she has, and her descendants continued.
Right. And it's interesting. I thought the portrayal of Mary, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the portrayal of Mary in this project is different from how we sometimes see Mary portrayed as very much enjoying the affair with Henry VIII and, benefiting rather than being forced into it. So that was really interesting.
Yes, and also I felt it was important to also point out a common myth, which started very early on, that she was, a sort of, a slut who had sort of slept her way through the French court, and that there's a misunderstanding about something that the French king said, and he was actually referring to Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, not to Mary Boleyn. He wrote on a drawing of her, more dirty than queenly, and that was not about Mary Boleyn. That was obviously about Mary Tudor.
Okay, but you see how that, through time really tarnished in a way Mary Boleyn's reputation. So I do think it's important to go back and look at what really happened and clear that up, which was great. Did you feel like her relationship with Anne, because we hear a lot more probably about Anne and her brother George than we do about Anne and Mary. So what do you think about that relationship between Anne and Mary?
Well, it was obviously a very complex one. I mean, can you imagine two sisters having slept with the same man?
Right.
It's not really a very pleasant thought, is it? And sibling, think of how sibling rivals, and then you have that background, and then one of them, the second, and then instead of being rejected, becomes Queen of England. I think it was obviously a very complex relationship.
Right. But as you point out, at the end, it is Mary who survives, and her children become very good friends with Anne's daughter, Elizabeth. So that next generation seems to sort of resolve the complications, because they truly seem to be.
That's right. And I'm sure that Mary was horrified when Anne was, tried and executed, and that would kind of, if whatever the bitterness of the past, you would reassess things, wouldn't you, if you were in her shoes? And I'm sure that would have happened,
right,
during that tragic period. And of course, George was her brother as well. Her brother was executed as well. It was her brother. I can't forget. Not just
Mm-hmm.
Anne's brother. It was her brother. And her
Right.
whole family was suddenly ruined. And she grew closer to her father, with whom she'd also had a very difficult relationship after Anne's death. I think so tragedy can bring people together in a way as well.
Well, and that's an interesting way to think about those who remained from that family. Like you say, the relationships among uh, Mary and her father, and maybe thoughts about her brother and her sister being closer in some ways. So, yeah, what came out of that tragedy, that horrible tragedy. All right. So that sets up a little context for Anne Boleyn. We're going to come back in a moment. But Henrietta Maria. So the subject of your latest book, and I have it right here. That's the one I have with me of yours right here. Um, there are so many things about this book to love, but I have to tell you right from the title. And so the sort of subtitle or subhead is The Warrior Queen Who Divided a Nation. And I really love that. I think that idea of a warrior queen and the impact she had. So can you tell us a little bit about Henrietta Maria, how you chose her? And I think a lot of people don't know a lot about her. So sort of introduce us to this quite amazing Queen Consort.
Well, Maryland was named after her.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of worth knowing. So she was a French princess, the daughter of Henri IV, known as Henry the Great in France, and Marie de Medici. And she married Charles I, who was one of England's most disastrous monarchs. The country fell into civil war and he ended up being beheaded. She has been much maligned and is really probably one of Britain's most reviled queen consorts. Incredibly unfairly, as I described, she was actually, I think, one of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable one to have worn the crown of the three kingdoms, which of course Anne never did, because Anne was only Queen of England, and
Mm-hmm.
Henrietta Maria was Queen of Scots as well as of England. Um, and so I wanted to take a fresh look at her and this extraordinary, incredibly rich life that she led, and also I saw in her much that reminded me of Anne Boleyn, who I'd very much enjoyed writing about in the past, and I can see in them both great, things they have in common and intriguing differences in their story as well.
Right. So let's just move right into that because I think it's often really illuminating to pick a couple of characters and you pick these two rich, wonderful women who in both cases, were quite maligned by history. Still somewhat controversial, Anne Boleyn and Henrietta Maria. But what sort of commonalities, what do they share in terms of their stories?
Well, of course, they were both French educated. Henrietta Maria was a part of the French royal family, and Anne Boleyn was raised as certainly as a young adult at the French court. Henrietta Maria was very familiar with Anne Boleyn's story. And when they arrived in England, or in the case of Anne Boleyn, returned to England as an adult, having left it as a child, they were both perceived as being incredibly chic and attractive. They both had these flashing black eyes. They were both incredibly intelligent and spirited women, and very sophisticated. They brought sort of French sophistication, a French joie de vivre to the English court. They both had, I suppose, real love affairs with their husbands, unusually for the time. Anne and Henry fell in love. In the case of Henrietta Maria and Charles, they quarreled at first, but then they fell very much in love with each other. So
Hmm.
they had that kind of passion for the men in their lives, something else that they very much shared. And they were also unpopular for their religious views and their religious beliefs, which were out of sync with those of the majority in England at the time. So in the case of Anne Boleyn, she was well, she wasn't a Protestant, she was a sort of proto-Protestant. She was certainly interested in religious reform and was very much perceived as being part of a movement that embraced the dissolution of the monasteries, for example, and which was very much disliked. England was extremely conservative religiously, and they didn't like that, and they did not like Anne Boleyn much either. The Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was much more popular.
Hmm.
And so Anne was really quite detested by the general public. In the case of Henrietta Maria, she was a Catholic. By the time she arrived in England, England was a firmly Protestant country that had lived through the Spanish Armada, the Gunpowder Plot. And so Henrietta Maria's religious beliefs, and indeed the Queen herself, were viewed with enormous suspicion. And she was viciously attacked for her religion and blamed for things which actually had nothing whatever to do with her. So they had that in common as well, that experience, I suppose,
Hmm.
of being, of attracting, the hatred of the public, which must have been difficult. They're both sort of, I suppose, followed and detested. So they both provoked extremely strong feelings in people.
That's really interesting, and I wonder. Certainly, the religious difference with the majority of the country is part of that, but you also mentioned how intelligent and spirited they both are, and as women, that's not always well received at
No,
court
and
either.
yeah, absolutely right. And interestingly, both of them would quarrel, would have quite extremely heated quarrels with their husbands, who I said, they both loved their husbands, but they
Hmm.
were also capable of fighting cat and dog with their husbands. So Anne Boleyn could be extremely sharp with Henry VIII, and was, certainly was known for speaking her mind,
Hmm.
even with the king. And so was Henrietta Maria. She was much younger, though. I mean, she was only 15 when she arrived in England, married to a king who was an adult, 25 years old. And one of the things I quite enjoyed, actually, reading and writing about Henrietta Maria, are these sort of teenage years when she has some of her arguments. I mean, they are so, remind me so much of, just the universal teenager, really. So there's one terrible scene she has with Charles when they're in bed together, and she says, "Look, my mother and I have decided that we would like to have these French people running my estates in England." And Charles, understandably, says, "No, you can't. You can't have any French people running your English estates. No, absolutely not." And she then completely loses her temper, and she sort of says, "You're so horrible. My life is miserable. And, it's all a disaster, and everything is all your fault." And I just thought to myself, God, who hasn't heard that from, an angry teenager? My life is horrible and it's all your fault.
Hmm.
But she would have more sophisticated arguments with Charles as well later on, when he was making disastrous decisions that helped pave the way to the Civil War and helped lose the Civil War. She had
Right.
furious arguments with him, trying to trying to suggest how he might save himself and save his country, unfortunately unsuccessfully. And yes, so they were both extremely spirited, and as you say, that certainly wasn't popular. There's a what you see with both of them is I suppose that women are so often seen in the light of the story of, Adam and Eve, where Eve is always seducing Adam into
Hmm.
evil, and so Anne Boleyn is supposed to be a bad influence on Henry VIII, and is supposed to be responsible for the dissolution of the greatest monasteries, which she actually wasn't, and Henrietta Maria is also supposed to have had influence over Charles's, some of his less popular decisions, when she wasn't.
Yeah.
It's what Alexander Dumas, who wrote the Three Musketeers, called, chercher la femme, seek out the woman. There's always a woman to blame somewhere behind everything.
Well, that's really interesting because yes, both husbands made some pretty bad decisions and both these women were definitely blamed. So roll out, especially Henrietta's Maria's story, because both marriages end with a beheading, but they end differently with a beheading. And Henrietta Maria actually has influence in the future. So roll that some of the differences.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, the difference comes at a sort of turning point over a story, in a way, a strange story, which in some ways they share, which is not well known about Henrietta Maria. So we all know, those who know about Anne Boleyn all know this, how she was accused of having an affair with a musician, Mark Smeaton. And this was one of the things that paved the way to her execution, that she was supposed to have plotted with Smeaton and with other lovers to have the king's death, Henry VIII's death, and she was then executed for treason. People are always saying that she was executed for adultery. She wasn't executed for adultery. Adultery was not a treasonous offence. Anne Boleyn was executed for plotting the king's death with her lovers, her supposed lovers, of whom Mark Smeaton was one. And Thomas Cromwell played a role in this. Henry VIII's leading minister. He wanted to get rid of Anne Boleyn, and he used a weak man like Mark Smeaton to help him do that. This musician. Now, Charles I also had a minister favourite called the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, and he also disliked the potential power and influence that he thought that Henrietta Maria could have. And he also suggested that she was having an affair with a musician, a lute player. But interestingly, this didn't actually get anywhere, because in the case of Anne Boleyn, the story of her supposed affair with Mark Smeaton happened when her marriage was breaking down. She had just had a miscarriage. She'd failed to produce a son. And so her position was very weak, and her husband turned against her. Henry VIII turned against her. In the case of Henrietta Maria, this happened at a time when her husband was falling in love with her. So she was in a much stronger position. And so she survived this attempt to tar her with the claims of being sexually attracted to a lute player. And she went on to have many, many children with Charles. So in that sense, their stories are absolute opposites. And so no, she certainly wasn't going to be executed. But unfortunately, her husband, as I said, made some poor decisions that led to civil war. I mean, he wanted to reform the Church of England. He was a Protestant, very much a Protestant until the day he died, but he wanted a more ceremonial form of Protestantism. And Puritans, who were sort of Calvinists who disliked ceremonial, were very angry about that. So that was one of the things that Charles did that made him unpopular. He fell out with Parliament over a number of things, including his loyalty to the Duke of Buckingham, and eventually ruled without Parliament for 11 years. That made him unpopular. He also, which is often overlooked, lost his wars. He fought a war with the Habsburgs. He fought a war with the French, the Bourbons. Henrietta Maria's own family lost these wars. Lost a war against his own subjects, the Scots. And kings who lose their battles don't necessarily keep their throne for very long.
Right.
Anyway, so England ended up in civil war, and Henrietta Maria tried to tell him before the civil war broke out that he needed to try and work to regain the love of his people, that he should give up powers before they were taken from him. But he wasn't really capable of showing the necessary flexibility to do that, nor was he as ruthless as his enemies. And the result being that there was a civil war. Henrietta Maria then played an extraordinary. I said she's a warrior. I mean, and she, before the Civil War broke out, just on the cusp of the Civil War, people were convinced that Charles would lose very quickly, that he'd lose the first battle of the Civil War, because Parliament had most of the men, most of the money, most of the arms. But Henrietta Maria went to Holland, where she raised money and arms, and she essentially saved his bacon. And so he survived the first great battle of the Civil War. And then she came back from Holland to England, brought more money, more men, more arms, and Parliament tried very hard to kill her. And there's very dramatic descriptions of her under shell fire in Yorkshire, where the parliamentarian navy, they've discovered where she's staying in this cottage on the quayside, and they're shelling the house she's in, and she runs, across fields carrying her little dog into a ditch, and the bullets flying over her head. A man is killed only yards from her. I mean, this is real proper battle stuff. She survives that, and then she spends time in the north of England, where her armies have several victories before she joins Charles at his Civil War capital in the southwestern Oxford, and takes, I may say, a town on her way south, Burton-on-Trent, in was described as a bloody and desperate fight. But when she's in Oxford, she advises Charles to use the advantages they now have to take London, and he doesn't. He decides to go and do something else instead. And she sees this later as a sort of turning point, because she knows that if Charles doesn't win quickly, the Scots will join the English Civil War on Parliament's side, and the numbers will be stacked against the king. And this is exactly what happens.
Right.
And she goes back to France to try and help him by raising more money, more arms, and so forth. But Charles is defeated, and of course, eventually tried and executed. But the difference here again with and so there's that difference, is that it's not Henrietta Maria who's executed; it's her husband who loses his head. And that's there's a terribly moving descriptions of her being given the news in Paris in the Louvre, and she's so stunned that she can't move, and she sits at the table for hours as the sort of sun sets, until one of her relatives takes her by the hand and leads her away. But she goes on to sort of fight another day. She goes on to help her son, Charles II, right, who is eventually restored as king in 1660. And she becomes, again, a very powerful and successful queen. This is not how she's depicted often in history. In fact, I think I'm probably the first person to pretty much point it out.
Right.
People tend to leave her just after the Restoration, when one of her children, she has several, her youngest son, dies. And there's a description by a famous diarist called Samuel Pepys describing her dressed in black and looking very ordinary. But you might not look at your best when your baby has, your youngest child has just died. I don't think most of us would be looking sort of jolly particularly. And what the historians don't quote is the same man, the same diarist, writing a couple of years later, when she's recovered from this tragedy, and saying that her court is the greatest in England, and merrier even than that of the merry monarch Charles II. And she is described as a phoenix queen, and that's right. She's risen from the ashes of war, from the ashes of all the tragedies that she's lived through, including the execution of her husband. And I suppose that again is where she differs from Anne, is that she is a survivor, Anne isn't. But right. But Anne, of course, Anne's legacy is going to be her daughter Elizabeth, who is a great queen.
Right.
Whereas Henrietta Maria, after she's dead, of course, you can't fight your children's battles. You can fight your own battles. You can't really fight your children's battles ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
And her second son, James II, loses the thrones of England and Scots, and the Stuart dynasty passes into history. However,
Right.
interestingly, Prince William, and indeed Prince Harry, but Prince William and his children are directly descended from Henrietta Maria through Charles II and two of his mistresses.
That seems particularly appropriate. That's wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
So we are still experiencing some of the legacy of Henrietta Maria. And some people would say, with the very recent death of the second Elizabeth, which called to mind in great part the first Elizabeth, we've sort of been grappling again with the legacy of Anne Boleyn. So you mentioned when we first started talking that in particular, as you looked at history and got excited about history, it's the women in particular that appealed to you or that you wanted to learn more about, which I think you can really see when you look at these two women, how much impact and influence they have, certainly on their husbands, who are the kings, and on the country for that way, but also just in the way they both spoke up and sort of refused to be told what to do in all cases. And if their husbands had perhaps listened to them a little more, particularly in the case of Henrietta Maria, things would have gone a little better. So how does this help you sort of reinforce the need for all of us to pay more attention to the women in these stories, not to the big attention grabbing Henry VIII or the Merry Monarch?
Well, it has to be that when I was a child, I was much more interested in the men, because it seemed to me the men were the ones who did everything. Because this is, of course, what we were told.
Right.
So I thought, oh yeah, men. Who's interested in the women? You know, particularly as I said, I was a bit of a tomboy, so I wasn't interested in sort of girlies skipping around in frocks. And I thought, so I was only really interested in the men. And when I went to Oxford, believe it or not, there were 7 male undergraduates to every woman. I mean, there were very few girls.
Wow.
When I was an undergraduate, very few. And when I went into journalism, indeed, there were very few women. And in fact, in those days, you had to be a member of a union, a journalist union. Mm-hmm. And I was made a quality officer for the whole of the sort of East End of London, because there was nobody who wasn't white, and I was the only woman. So that was really weird. It's not because I was so special. It was literally because I was like the only person who wasn't a white male. But anyway, but so I was more interested in the boys and boys stuff. But then as I started, as I suppose grew up, and I read more, I thought to myself, this is wrong. This is really wrong. These women are really interesting and they're really important. And so and I think, yes, and I think that's the thing, is when you read history, one must always ask questions. And if something niggles, if something doesn't quite ring true or seem right, just look into it. And I always want to say to school children, to say something new, you don't have to necessarily discover some old manuscript crumbling in some archive that you, age 16, don't have access to. Right. Although I have found, uncovered manuscripts, I think often the most interesting things that I've discovered are there in plain sight. If you look for it, if you start asking the questions and saying, right, okay, but is that actually what happened at the time, or is this something someone's just telling me? You can discover a lot in what is published material that is contemporary. and uncover new stories. So it's more accessible to
Right.
rewrite history than you would think.
Right. And the idea of bring your questions to whatever it is you're reading or whatever you're researching and reviewing. Bring your own fresh
Exactly.
questions and you can see it with new eyes. That's wonderful.
And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So it's something we can all do. We can all do. It doesn't, you know, if you're on the, yes, it's not the exclusive preserve of people who have access to manuscripts that maybe if you're living in the middle of, you know, middle of nowhere,
Mm-hmm.
or you're a school child, you don't.
Right. Right. Well, that's a wonderful way to think of it. So, as we wrap up this wonderful discussion, and I just can't thank you enough, tell us what you're working on, how we can follow you, where we can learn more about what you're doing. Sort of bring us up to speed on that.
Well, I'm on social media. I'm just on Twitter at the moment. I was on Facebook, but something happened. I'm not quite sure what. I think I got shut out of my own account. I have no idea why. But anyways, I suppose I ought to do something about that. But I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter, and I have a website, leanderdelisle.com, where you can read about my books.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm producing a chapter for a new book on kings and queens of England. At the moment, I'm doing, you know, lectures and things like that. I want to take it. I mean, I usually by this stage I'm already commissioned to do another book. I'm not this time really because I just want to take a break and think about what I really think about. Take some time to think about what I want to do next. Because I've sort of like lost track, 4 or 5 books. You know what, and each one takes 3 or 4 years, but
Right.
nevertheless, it's sort of 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, I'm always on the go, always my
Mm-hmm.
nose to the grindstone, and I think that's, you know, the time's come to step back, have a
Mm-hmm.
period of reflection, and that's one thing I'd like to do. Does that sound terrible? I don't know.
No, that sounds wonderful. Because that's when those really insightful questions, I think, begin to emerge.
I think you're right, actually. And funnily enough, as a writer, I find that it's in the quiet moments.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I'm talking too long now, but so when I was working as a journalist, for example, as a columnist or whatever, you have deadlines, very quick deadlines. And they could ring me up, and the newspaper might ask me to write something, you know, a few hours. And even so, I would sometimes, halfway through writing it, even though I was under this time pressure, I'd go upstairs to my bedroom and I'd actually lie on my bed for 30 minutes and close my eyes, to let my sort of thoughts clear, and the sort of jumble of thoughts
Mm-hmm.
become clearer, and to see what it is that I really wanted to say and that was important. And with books as well, the same is true. And so often, sometimes I think when I've almost finished writing the book, that suddenly things will start coming together, and I'll suddenly see a particular pattern, or a particular question will strike me. I mean, with one of
Mm-hmm.
my books, for example, it suddenly struck me that this very famous description of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, made no sense, and I wondered if it had been in fact invented, but it didn't fit in with other things I knew, and all these stories about her mother just didn't ring true with what I knew that was factual from the time. And it was just stuff that historians have been saying again and again and
Mm-hmm.
again, repeating each other, building on these myths that they were creating. And so I had to sort of look at things right at the very end, and discovered indeed that this famous description of Jane had been totally invented, made up by someone who was frustrated that there wasn't a portrait of Lady Jane Grey, so they just invented a description of her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is constantly repeated. Well, until I wrote my book, The Sisters That Would Be Queen.
Well, and see, that's one of the great things about taking the time to bring questions to what you're looking at or hearing or reading over and over, and figure out, where did this start? And
Yes,
perhaps,
it's good. It's good to dream, to almost have, to almost to be in almost a dream state. So if you're like, I find it difficult to listen to books sometimes because my mind tends to wander.
mm,
So if I'm reading a book, I can mark my place, and then I let my mind wander off while I think about what I've read. And sometimes if I'm listening to it in the car or something, then of course my mind wanders, and suddenly a whole chapter of this book I'm listening to has passed. I have to rewind. But I do think those are, if you're a writer or researching, that sort of dream time is very important when you're reflecting on what you've heard and you're thinking, you're passing things over slowly in your mind. Yeah.
Well, that's right, and that's probably great for all of us to think about, to take the time to let it sort of marinate sometimes in our mind, as we're
Yeah.
imagining and thinking about these things and these people, which is how we bring that fresh perspective. So, well, thank you so much. This is wonderful. And I will put your books in the show notes and your website and Twitter. For now, if you do find out about Facebook, we'll put that in as well. But
Yeah.
I so appreciate your taking the time to take us inside these two women in particular, but then the whole notion of history and exploring and learning and continuing to be curious all the time, and the powerful things we learn when we take those steps. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much to Leanda de Lisle for joining us to discuss these two amazing, fascinating women. And thank you for listening. I so appreciate it. And I so appreciate your joining me on this journey as we shake up history together.